She moved like silence itself, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and certainly unprotected. In the grand halls of the Vatican, where power wore crimson and gold, she wore plain black. A uniform. A name tag. And skin that made her an afterthought. Her name was Grace. She was serving wine at a banquet meant for dignitaries and cardinals. The laughter was loud. The toasts, pretentious. But it was the sound of a quiet wince that pulled her eyes toward the shadows near the colonnade. A man. Elderly, slumped, gripping his ankle. She didn't recognize the face. She didn't need to. She rushed to him, knelt beside him, and offered water and a whispered prayer. No cameras. No glory. Just compassion. She didn't know she was tending to Pope Leo XIV in disguise. But someone else saw her. Cardinal Tagle. And in a room full of robes and rings and whispered politics, one command fell sharper than a blade: fire her. No trial. No conversation. Just exile. Grace was escorted out of the Vatican like a trespasser, humiliated for helping a man no one recognized. But then, the man she helped rose to his feet. And what he said next, shattered the silence of centuries. His voice was not loud, yet it carried like thunder across the marble floor. Pope Leo XIV had risen. But no one in that banquet hall recognized him as such, not yet. His cassock was concealed beneath a simple overcoat. No guards. No heralds. Only a walking cane, a slight limp, and the eyes of a man who had seen too much, and trusted too little. The man Grace had helped was not just a guest. He was the shepherd of over 1 billion souls. But Grace didn't know that when she knelt beside him. She was 26. Born in Calabar, raised by a widowed mother who scrubbed mission floors for coins and prayed with the kind of faith that made devils tremble. Grace had grown up washing the feet of old priests and serving soup to nuns who barely noticed her presence. Her hands had carried Bibles long before they carried silver trays. Rome had always been the dream. She believed that if she could reach the Vatican, if she could just get close enough to the heart of the Church, she might one day study theology, perhaps even teach it. But dreams, like her people, were often expected to serve and never to speak. She arrived with nothing but a visa, a worn leather Bible, and her mother's final blessing whispered between hospital machines. And now, that dream was unraveling in seconds. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle had spotted her during the banquet. He had been watching, not the limping man, but the young woman who dared to show concern without permission. To the world, Tagle was the darling of reform, a bishop who smiled for cameras and quoted liberation theology with eloquence. But behind cathedral doors, he governed like a man who feared disorder more than injustice. He preferred order. Predictability. Obedience. Grace's simple act of kindness was not noble to him, it was disruptive. She had crossed an invisible line, one drawn not by scripture, but by tradition twisted into hierarchy. The room was filled with power. Men whose rings had been kissed so often, they forgot what unkissed hands felt like. Long tables gleamed with polished crystal and gold-plated utensils. There were cameras at the edges, official Vatican coverage for public transparency. But what they never filmed, were the private corridors behind the banquet, where workers walked like shadows. And Pope Leo had chosen, that night, to walk with them. He had ordered his guards to remain outside. He dressed plainly. He limped alone into the halls his predecessors had floated through like monarchs. He wanted to see how his staff lived. What they whispered when no bishop stood near. He wanted to see the church from beneath, not from above. And then he fell. A loose stone near a service hallway turned his step. He cried out, quiet and restrained. And only one soul heard him. Grace. In a hall full of cardinals, only she noticed. This was never about class. It was about visibility. It was about who gets remembered, and who gets removed. And as she was dismissed for her compassion, the room made a decision. It stood with the robes. But the Pope, he stood with the nameless. And what he would do next, would leave the entire Vatican frozen in disbelief. If you believe some stories should never be buried, subscribe now. And if you don't, ask yourself why your silence feels more comfortable than this truth. The banquet had ended. The plates were cleared. The chandeliers above still burned with a golden glow, illuminating empty chairs that only hours before had been filled with influence and applause. The final toasts had been made. The cardinals now retreated to their quarters or lingered in corners with whispered counsel. But Grace remained, wiping down silver with aching arms, collecting crumpled napkins with the precision of someone who took even invisible work seriously. Then came the silence before the storm. Footsteps, measured, deliberate, echoing against marble and memory, approached her from behind. Cardinal Tagle. His voice was soft, almost kind. But in it was a tone so controlled, so carefully curated, it chilled more than it calmed. "Why were you alone with that guest?" he asked. Grace didn't turn immediately. She felt the tension wrap around her spine. She'd grown up learning to read authority not by its words, but by its pauses. "He was limping," she said, quietly. "He looked like he needed help. So I helped." She kept her eyes lowered, not in fear, but in habit. In places of power, eye contact from the lowly is often interpreted as arrogance. She had learned long ago to survive through humility. Tagle folded his hands behind his back. There was no anger in his expression. No raised voice. Only silence, stretched too long. "You're not permitted to engage with guests privately," he said at last. "Especially not without authorization." There it was. Not rage. Not indignation. Just policy. Grace blinked. Her lips parted to speak, but nothing came. There was no defense. Nothing she could say would change what had already been decided. "You are dismissed from tonight's duties," Tagle added. "Collect your things." And just like that, the life she had built in Rome, quietly, humbly, beneath the shadow of every grand pillar, began to dissolve. She gave a small nod, chest tight, throat locked. She didn't cry. Not yet. As she turned toward the kitchen hallway, she didn't notice the figure watching from the narrow corridor to her left. He was partially concealed, his coat draped over one arm, leaning against the wall with eyes not of power, but of sorrow. Pope Leo XIV. He had witnessed everything. Not from a throne. Not from behind a microphone or the sanctuary altar. But from the hallway where workers walk alone. Where judgments fall swiftly, and where compassion, when it dares to show its face, is punished. He had heard the question. He had seen the answer. He had watched Tagle speak like a judge over someone who had only offered mercy. And for a moment, he said nothing. Because sometimes the silence of the righteous is not fear, but preparation. There is a storm that waits for the perfect moment to break. And in that moment, it began. If you believe there's still power in unseen kindness, then speak by subscribing now. And if you don't, ask yourself why silence feels safer than truth. The stillness in the hall had thickened. The scent of polished silver, aged wine, and pride lingered in the air. Grace had just finished folding her apron when a sharp voice rang out, clear, deliberate, devoid of warmth. "Escort her out, permanently." It was not a suggestion. Cardinal Tagle stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by the soft shuffle of other clergy beginning to take notice. 2 uniformed guards entered through the side, summoned not by chaos, but by command. Their pace was slow, respectful, but their intent unmistakable. This wasn't just dismissal. It was removal. Erasure. Final. The other servers paused mid-motion, eyes low, breaths held. No one moved. No one spoke. Not because they agreed, but because fear teaches silence better than any catechism. Grace turned, eyes wide, not with defiance, but with the heartbreak of being discarded by the very house she had hoped would hold her. She stepped forward toward the exit, whispering under her breath, barely audible, "Lord, let me leave with dignity." And then, a voice. Low. Steady. Unhurried. "She stays." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't a command dressed in thunder. It came like a still wind through stone, a breeze that bends the trees without snapping a single branch. All heads turned. From the edge of the servants' hallway, emerging from the corridor of silence, stepped the man Grace had helped. No guards. No papal entourage. Just a plain coat, a wooden cane, and the eyes of a man whose authority needed no introduction. Tagle stiffened. His face flushed, not red with guilt, but pale with calculation. He straightened his shoulders, but his voice betrayed a subtle tremble as he asked, "And who are you to overrule a cardinal?" The figure paused. Then, with a measured hand, he lifted the hood from his head. The light struck his face, and like ripples across a glassy lake, recognition spread from one corner of the room to the other. First a gasp. Then a murmur. Then, silence so thick it hummed. "I am a servant," Pope Leo said quietly, just like her. There was no applause. No immediate reverence. Only the sound of guards halting mid-step, unsure whether to bow or disappear. Tagle stepped back ever so slightly, as if the revelation had stolen the ground from under him. But Leo wasn't done. His eyes didn't rest on Tagle. They turned to Grace. Still standing. Still waiting. Still afraid. He moved toward her, each step deliberate, the weight of his limp no longer a mark of frailty but a symbol of journey. "She showed mercy," Leo said. "Not for reward. Not for recognition. But because compassion, true compassion, doesn't wait for permission." He turned to the stunned faces around them. "Let it be known, in this house, kindness will not be punished." And in that moment, centuries of invisible suffering trembled. Not because justice had won. But because someone in power had finally seen. If you believe the church was meant to shelter the broken, not cast them out, then subscribe now. And if you won't, ask yourself why this truth unsettles you more than the injustice that caused it. The Pope's words lingered in the air like incense, soft, fragrant, undeniable. But for Cardinal Tagle, they stung like ash in the eyes. He stepped forward, a man suddenly unsure of the floor beneath him. "You're being manipulated, Holy Father," he said, his voice low, urgent. "You don't know what she's done. You don't know who she is. This is not how we maintain order." The words were spoken quickly, but their weight fell flat. It was not the voice of a shepherd now, it was the voice of a man clinging to his robes as the wind of truth threatened to strip them away. Pope Leo didn't flinch. His cane remained grounded. His eyes locked not on Tagle, but on something far beyond him. "No," he said, slowly, like scripture recited from memory. "I'm not being manipulated." He took another step toward Grace. "I've just remembered what power feels like, when it touches the poor." He looked at her, not as a ruler to a servant, but as a man to a soul. A brother to a sister. The room was watching, but for a moment, it felt as though the walls had collapsed. No marble. No titles. No hierarchy. Just one man who limped. And the woman who stopped to help him. Leo's voice softened. "Tell me, child, did you know who I was?" Grace, still trembling but standing straight, shook her head. "No," she said. "I just saw a man in pain." A quiet intake of breath swept the room. The kind of breath one takes when watching something sacred unfold. Leo closed his eyes for a moment, as if letting the truth of those words settle in his bones. "That's what heaven sees too." He turned slowly to the gathering of clerics. Men who had spent their lives wrapped in tradition and protocol, many of whom were now shifting in discomfort under robes suddenly heavier than ever before. Heaven does not see vestments, the Pope said. It does not count titles. It does not weigh protocol. His voice deepened, not with volume, but with gravity. It sees suffering. It sees the hands that serve. The eyes that notice. The hearts that pause. That is why I am here. Not to uphold a system that forgets the hurting, but to remind the Church what Christ looked like when he walked among us. The silence in the room became sacred. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. It was the kind of silence that only follows truth. Cardinal Tagle, still frozen in place, opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. There was nothing to defend. Not anymore. In that moment, the power had shifted, not because Leo had seized it, but because he had surrendered it to compassion. And in doing so, he reclaimed it fully. The Pope now stood alone in the center of the hall, his frame small compared to the columns that surrounded him, yet no one could look away. Not from his eyes. Not from his words. He turned slowly, not just toward Tagle, but to every seated figure clothed in crimson. If helping the broken is grounds for dismissal, Leo said, then dismiss me too. The sentence fell with the force of a bell tolling at midnight. A single echo. A solemn summons. No one responded. They didn't need to. The weight of his voice had already reached their bones. I once met a man, Leo continued, outside a cathedral in Palermo. I was just a young priest then, ambitious, devout, naive. It was winter. I passed by him 3 times that day, on my way to appointments about the cathedral's new marble altar. His eyes flickered as the memory returned, unpolished, raw. On the 3rd pass, I looked down. His shoes were soaked through. His lips cracked from the cold. I asked him his name. He smiled and handed me half of his bread. The Pope's voice broke slightly, not with emotion, but with memory. Not because I was hungry, but because I looked lost. He paused. I've never forgotten that moment. Not because he gave me bread, but because he gave it without needing to know my title. A rustle moved through the rows of cardinals, vestments shifting, spines straightening. The discomfort of memory rising in those who had long traded presence for protocol. Leo continued. What disqualifies you before men, he said, may be the very reason heaven remembers your name. Whispers now, subdued but unmistakable, among Vatican aides lining the edges. Eyes darting. Notes passed in quiet haste. Some bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in reckoning. Tagle, still standing, couldn't remain silent. Holy Father, he said sharply, protocol matters. We cannot have chaos. The Church must function by structure, not sentiment. Leo turned toward him fully, his face solemn. Protocol, he repeated, is meant to guide order. But protocol without compassion, is tyranny dressed in silk. A sharp intake of breath cut through the room. Several bishops lowered their eyes. One, a thin, aged cleric near the rear, lifted his hand, slowly, and offered a single, trembling applause. It was not for drama. It was not for rebellion. It was the sound of a man who had waited decades for truth to be spoken aloud, in a place where truth had learned to whisper. Leo did not bask in it. He simply returned his gaze to Grace. She stood still, tears glistening but unshed. Her dignity had not left her, it had been restored. The Pope raised his chin slightly. If she is unfit to serve, he said, then perhaps it is the Church that has forgotten how to. And with that, centuries of silent injustice met the unmovable wall of mercy. If your soul stirred at the sound of truth clothed in humility, then hit subscribe now. And if you won't, go to the comments and explain why protocol without love should still lead God's house. The tension in the room no longer gripped like a fist. It opened, slowly, tremblingly, into something softer. Something human. Pope Leo turned once more to Grace. The chaos behind him faded. For a moment, all of Rome seemed to vanish beneath the hush of two souls meeting at the altar of truth. He stepped closer and opened his arms, not as a pontiff commanding reverence, but as a father embracing the heart of what the Church had nearly discarded. Grace hesitated only for a breath, then collapsed into him, not from weakness, but from the unbearable release of being seen. "You were not dismissed," Leo whispered into her hair, "you were dignified." He turned again to the room. This time, not with rebuke, but with restoration. "She reminds us," he said slowly, "of what we have forgotten. Mercy has no rank." There were no cheers. Only stillness. The kind that follows the turning of a tide. The Pope looked to his aides. "Effective immediately, she will no longer serve at banquet tables." A murmur rose. Leo raised his hand, once, gently, and the room returned to quiet. "She will serve, beside me." He reached for Grace's hand, guiding her forward with the reverence once reserved only for robes. "She is to be my steward," he said. Because where power once saw disruption, heaven saw devotion. Grace's lips trembled. "Why me?" she asked, barely audible. Leo smiled. "Because when no one was watching, you loved like Christ." And in that moment, it was no longer about her. It was about all of us. About the choices made in unseen corridors. About the quiet acts of courage that never make headlines. About the aching question that still echoes in churches, cathedrals, homes, and hearts: when we see pain, what will we do? The banquet had ended hours ago, but the real communion had only just begun. The marble floors had witnessed many declarations, doctrines, dogmas, decrees. But on this night, it witnessed something rarer: humility crowned as courage, and the forgotten raised higher than the mighty. Now, as silence settles once more over Vatican stone and candlelight flickers against robes newly sobered by reflection, one question remains, one that cannot be answered by titles or tradition. What would you have done, if you stood beside her? Would you have looked away to protect your comfort? Would you have obeyed the cardinal, or stood with the broken? Would your silence have spoken louder than your heart? Because in the end, the judgment that matters most will not ask how high we climbed, but how deeply we loved. So may we all seek truth with humble hearts. And never mistake applause for anointing. Subscribe to God's Message for Souls, not for stories, but for awakenings. And if you still won't, then enter the comments and answer this with honesty: what part of this truth made you pause, or made you pray?